All right. So, as we get started, I just wanted to start by giving you guys a reference of where we are in the class. So we have gotten done with the stochastic processes part of the class. So in general, we talk about two different portions of stochastic processes: discrete time, discrete space stochastic processes, and then continuous time, continuous space stochastic processes, of which Poisson processes and coalescent processes are special examples. And in some ways, they're simpler examples, in some ways, they're more complex. So we are now done with that portion. And then, so we have two topics left. Topic 6 is about simulations, because we've used a lot of simulations in this class. And so we're going to just go one step further and ask, what if we want to go beyond what a stochastic process can easily let us do? And then the last section is about inference. So one of the ways that stochasticity shows up in the natural world is in data, which we were just talking about, biological data. And so if we want to then take that biological data and understand the world, we have to use stochastic processes to build inferences. Okay, so that's where we are at. And then, so given that we're going to talk about simulations, I want to just go over a review of what simulations we've used so far in this course. All right, so given what I just said about the different types of stochastic processes, we have talked about how to simulate each of these different types of stochastic processes. And these are good pseudocodes to just have in your mind, because simulation is one really important way of understanding a stochastic process, because it gives us individual sample trajectories rather than the summary of the probability distribution. All right, so the first type that we have is for discrete time, discrete space stochastic processes. And when we want to describe one of these processes, what is the key object that I need in order to describe a discrete time, discrete state stochastic process? Yes, Mario.
Transition probability matrix?
Exactly. So the first thing that we're going to need is we're just going to need to define our stochastic process in terms of the transition probabilities, which we'll use the standard notation of just a P matrix. And for the purposes of this example, let's consider an n by n matrix. So we have n states in our state space. If we wanted to write the code to simulate this, we always start with initializing, and we would set the initial state to something. So you can pick your initial condition. And then we have our loop, or our main portion of the simulation, where we want to loop through all of these discrete time steps. Notice that the time has constant incrementing here. And so for each of these time steps, we want to choose a new state using a weighted random number. Okay, and so how we do this is we take a random choice, and we have our vector of our state space. So we have our vector of states that we want to select from, and the weights come from, make sure I get this right, the transition probability matrix. So if we're currently at state xt, I want to select that row of the transition probability matrix, because that gives me the probability of going somewhere else from that state. So that will give me the weights, and then I can pick the state that I go to with respect to those states. And then ultimately, you should always return something, and always think about how you want to return stuff. So I'm not going to go over this in this in this class, but we talked about last time about how to simulate a phylogeny, which is very similar to simulating a coalescent. And so when you wanted to return the quantity there, you had to return a cophonetic matrix. So it's always important to think about how you're going to save the information and how you're going to return it. So here we have that we're going to return all of the x values up to xt max. Are there any questions about this pseudocode? And this gives you x of t plus 1. All right, so then the next type of simulation we had was for a Poisson process. If I want to specify a Poisson process, what do I need to specify? So when I had a discrete time, discrete state stochastic process, I had the transition probability matrix. Thanks, Mark, for that. What do I do if I have a Poisson process? What do I need to do to specify? You need to specify the transition probability matrix, a transition rate matrix, an offspring distribution. These are all different kinds of things that we've used to specify different stochastic processes. What specifies a Poisson process? Ooh, you're so close. So if I have a waiting time to the next event, how do I create that waiting time? If exponentially distributed with constant rate. So in order to specify a Poisson process, I have to specify my constant rate, which in this class, we just use the notation lambda because that's the standard. Okay. So here, when I initialize, you always initialize with the state being 0. That's a unique part about a Poisson process. It's a counting process, right? So we always start our counter at 0, and then we start picking our waiting times. So note that now in my loop portion, I have a while statement rather than an if statement because now I have continuous time, so I want to stop it after it reaches the maximum time. So to be fully robust, the first thing we need to do is we need to calculate the first waiting time. And then if t plus delta t is less than some maximum, then we increment t. We add 1 to our counter. Oh, sorry, I have to use the right notation here. X of t is equal to x plus, and we choose our new waiting time. When we return this function, it's not as easy as returning a discrete time stochastic process because we don't know how many elements we're going to have to return. Instead, we have to return a vector of all of the times and a vector of all of the corresponding x's. In this case, you don't actually need this vector of corresponding x's because they just go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's really boring. So you really just need this vector of times. Okay. Does that make sense? Yeah, Mark.
How come we're drawing the exponential distribution from delta t?
Because if we want to make sure that we don't step past the maximum, so I have to ask, where do I go next? And do I go past the maximum on the next? So I always want to ask, where do I go in the next step? So for example, delta t, what if delta t was bigger than t max, even the first one? Then I would jump past the end even on the first step. So you always want to ask, where do I go next, not where am I? Yeah. But I would not take off points if you didn't do that. It would just give you 1 more point. Is all it would do. Okay. And then the third type of process that we talked about simulating, maybe I'll just do it here. The third type of process that we talked about simulating was a continuous time, discrete space, stochastic process. Okay, how do I simulate this one? Yes, you're right, transition rate matrix. Which sometimes this is annoying to write down, so often we also just write down this table that says the events, their rates, and the effect of those. This is equivalent to specifying the transition rate matrix as a piecewise function. Okay, so given that I have my transition rate matrix, how do I simulate a continuous time discrete state stochastic process? Go for it. It's a Gillespie algorithm. And we've gone over this many times in class, so I'm not going to do that here. But this is just a reminder that as soon as you hear continuous time discrete state, think Gillespie algorithm. All right. Is there any questions about these three different types of simulation? Throughout this class, we've added some bells and whistles to each of them. So for example, by implementing a cophonetic matrix in our Gillespie algorithm, or expanding on the Poisson process to think about rates that aren't constant and these kind of things. But these are the three basic outlines of how you do these simulations, and everything else is just extra. Okay, but these three things are quite limited in the end in the range of things that they can do. They can do a lot of stuff, but there's a lot of complex biological processes that they will never be able to simulate. So, for example, if we want to simulate animal behavior, we have to have some sort of interaction between an animal and its environment that would be very hard to capture unless we had an extremely complicated stochastic process. And so with many different states and we already saw with an SIR model that if we want to include multiple dimensions in the stochastic process, it gets quite complicated quite fast. And so it can be really inefficient. So what if we want to go one step more complicated? How do we do that? And so that's going to be the topic of today's lecture, which is individual based. So in ecology and evolution, we call this individual based. In some other areas, they call it agent based for some reason. They're exactly the same kind of process as far as I can tell. And so in individual-based simulations, rather than thinking of different processes, we focus instead on individual elements and simulate stochastic trajectories when we have individuals that have their own behavior. So, or agents. I think the reason they use agent is they don't want to imply that it's a living organism, but you could imagine an agent that has its own specified algorithms. Okay. So before we can really talk about individual-based simulation, I want to actually step back and think bigger picture about how a computer works. And it's kind of surprising how often knowing how computer works is really important for doing algorithms correctly. So for example, in a couple of lectures, we'll talk about a log likelihood, and why we have to take the log of a likelihood is only because of the computer. Like if we could deal in math world, we would just deal with likelihoods. But since we deal with computers that have round off error, we have to go to a log likelihood. So the thing that I want to begin with talking about today is this concept of object-oriented programming. So computers have what we call primitive data types. So some of these primitive data types are integers, and I'm just gonna use the notation from C++ because it's kind of the standard basic notation. And then the notation in any specific programming language could be a little different, but you might have something like an integer or a double. A double is a decimal number. It's a decimal number with a certain amount of accuracy. Don't worry about that. It's called a double precision number, but just think about this as a decimal. You have characters, and you have booleans. Okay, so an integer is exactly what you would think an integer would be. Give me one example where we might want to use an integer as a variable in biology. Awesome. So, but give me a more biological example. That's a math example. What's one biological example? Great. Okay. The number of infected individuals. Does that difference make sense, Ananga?
Yeah.
Okay. Give me one example of a Boolean. So a Boolean is something that's either a 0 or a 1. It's a true false answer. That's one example of a biological example of a Boolean. Amazing. Survival. So we always specify Booleans by what would be the true answer, and then the opposite of that is false. And you could go through these and do each one of them as well. So a character could be M and F, or paternal and maternal. Those would all be characters. A double weight, waiting times, all of these could be doubles. Okay, so these are really, really powerful. And oftentimes, as we've seen in this class, we want to actually combine these into lists of vectors and matrices. Of a single primitive type. So you've done this extensively in your programming this semester. So whenever you use an NP array, it creates a vector, or in the case of 2 dimensions, it creates a matrix or a hypermatrix of a single primitive data type. So even if you didn't realize it, when you use an NP array, you are implicitly or either explicitly specifying which one of these types that you're going to use. Probably most of the time you ended up with a double, because probably one of the numbers in your array was a double, and then it would all become a double. But this is one power of NP arrays, is that you can actually specify what type they are. And so say that you only want ever to put an integer in that array, then it can save you a lot of computer space if you tell it, I want to save integers instead. So this is a really powerful thing, and has actually enabled almost everything that we've done so far in this class computationally, right? But in biology, as we just talked about, imagine that we're modeling an outbreak. We might want to combine multiple types of this data into one bucket, right? It would be nice to have an array where we can mix Booleans and doubles and integers. And so what this is called is a data structure. And if you are a R fan, this is your data frame. Okay, so a data structure allows you to combine different types. All right, so as an example, let's imagine that we are creating a program, an individual-based simulation, where we want to model the interaction between prey and predators. And you've got to specify a structure, a combined thing that combines different types of data that would do a good job of describing a single prey individual. How would we want to describe a single prey individual? give me one primitive data type that we might want to use. Yes. Yes. So I'm gonna change that just a little bit, just for one reason. That was really good. But oftentimes if it died, we just want to delete it, right? And so I'm gonna push you to do a good job with your data management. And so if it was dead, unless we were keeping some sort of data on the death, we would just delete it, right? So let's change your answer just a teeny bit to include something that we want to store. So one example would be like the state of the individual, whether it's foraging or not foraging. And that would switch back and forth. But great example. What's another type of primitive data type we might want to use? Okay, so yes, you could put an integer in here, which is its age. We could maybe have a double that it's health or some measure of quality and how many offspring it can reproduce, and so forth. Another bool would be sex, and so forth. Okay, so you can see how powerful structures can be in that they let us bring together different types of data, and you can even put an array inside of the structure. So we could easily put, for example, a double. I'll use C++ notation again. So this is a two array with two doubles or two decimal numbers in it. And one example of this could be location, where you need an X location and a Y location. Okay, so you can combine all these different data types. But sometimes it would be really helpful to combine those data types with functions that can use those data types. So we kind of want to put a bunch of variables and a bunch of functions in one bucket that we can then pass it out. And what this is called is it's called a class. So a class is a structure plus some functions. And these are special functions in that they have access to the variables in the structure without you having to give that function those variables. So usually when we specify a function, we have to pass it all of the information we want it to have. But if you specify a function inside of a class, it has access to all of those structure variables without you having to pass them. So that can be really convenient if you don't want to have like 30 arguments to each of your functions, right? Okay, so as an example of extending our prey class, we might want to write some functions. I'm going to use a little bit of Python notation actually, just so I don't have to explain the C++ notation. So you could have something like the age function where everybody matures. So if you run this function, it makes the individual a year older. You could have a behavior function where if you run this function, the prey decides whether it wants to eat or wants to flee the predator. So it makes a decision on what kind of behavior it wants to do. And each of these might need these different arguments from the structure. So for example, in behavior, you might really need to know your location, for example, and you might really need to know the health of the individual. Maybe it doesn't even have energy to run if it wanted to. Okay, so any questions about what a structure is and what a class is? So these are really powerful and they make programming like so much easier once you realize you can put things into buckets. So if you use R, you know how powerful a data frame can be in that you can put a whole data set of lots of different types of things into that data frame. So I kind of lied to you a little bit. A data frame is actually a class. A data frame is a class because it has functions that already are built in that you can use with that data frame. But we just don't have the power to add additional functions to the data frame. So it's kind of a built-in class that we can't modify. Okay, so a class is a template. If we want to have, so for example, we just wrote down the template of how to create a prey item. But there might be like 10 prey items in our simulation. There might be 100 prey items in our simulation. So each realization of a class is what we call an object. And hence the idea behind object-oriented programming is that now we have these buckets that specify our agents that we can then program with. Okay, so there's lots of computer science reasoning behind why we want to create objects and object-oriented programming. A lot of these I don't even know. I never took a computer science class, so this is just knowledge I've pieced together throughout time. But one key characteristic of objects is that they allow for the phenomenon of inheritance. And despite us being in a biology class, when I say inheritance, I do not mean that they have genes. I mean that they can inherit all of the properties of an object that they are contained in. So I can nest objects so that an object inside of an object has access to the bigger objects, variables and functions, and it also has access to its specific variables and functions. So it lets you nicely program in hierarchical structures. And this is really useful in biology because biology is really naturally hierarchically structured. So give me some examples of where we see hierarchies in biology. Yeah. Perfect. So Linnaean nomenclature. So this would be like kingdom, phylum, class, etc. Spelled wrong, but you get the idea. Okay. Okay, what's another example of hierarchy that we see in biology? Thank you, Luca. Somebody else? April? Fantastic. So food webs is a really good example. So we might have our key zone predator. And then you could actually have multiple things at these different levels. And then like your primary producers here. Now, of course, this is not strictly hierarchical, but it can be still object-oriented programming can be very important for trying to program something like a food web. So those are just two examples of many, many, many examples. So one example that I use all the time is the fact that individuals live in species, which are created of populations, which are created of individuals, which themselves have genomes, which have genes. And so when we want to do population genomics or population genetics, we really need to recognize that there's this hierarchical structure from gene up to a species. Okay, so that is why we use objects in biology. But now let's talk about why we use those objects to do individual-based simulations. So why would we ever want to do an individual-based simulation? or individual-based model. So what I'm going to tell you here is somewhat subjective. So just take this as my subjective view of the world. But a couple of examples of why we would want to do this is when we have really complex life cycles. So you could think of the life cycle of an infectious disease. If an infectious disease actually has to go through many, many different stages between initial infection and the final recovery of the individual, then we would have to model that as a really complex stochastic process with not just an S and an I state, but with like 10 different epidemiological states. And this is actually really common. If you want to model something like HIV or hepatitis B, all of these, they actually require modeling many, many states, not just an SIR model. And so that's one example of a complex life cycle. A second example is when we really want to capture individual variability. So staying on the infectious disease theme here, one example of individual variability is that humans vary enormously in our ability to transmit COVID, for example. This is one of the things that was so irksome when trying to model COVID, is that individuals exhibit different symptoms. Lots of people are asymptomatic or don't even exhibit symptoms at all. Other people die. And there's not actually like we can come up with covariates, but there's a lot of noise in there too. So if we really want to capture the dynamics of COVID, we have to account for the fact that individual realizations of COVID are quite different, and so we want to model that individually. Because as we've seen, the mean of a stochastic process does not necessarily equal the average dynamics of an average individual, the dynamics of an average individual, or the deterministic dynamics. So individual variability can be really important. I'm going to skip the next one, but this is kind of confusing. And then just when we want to model anything between interactions with the environment. So one key characteristic of almost all of the stochastic processes that we talked about in this class is that they were time independent or homogeneous processes, right? They're time homogeneous processes. And so if you wanted to model something that had to do with climate change, for example, then you'd want those stochastic processes to depend on time. And if you got a little glimpse about how hard it is to model a time-dependent stochastic process, for example, a heterogeneous Poisson process, it can be really difficult. And so it's just sometimes easier to ignore the stochastic process, the formalism of it, and just simulate it with this. Similarly, if things are non-Markovian, we kind of have to throw the stochastic processes out the window unless it's very simple, and we have to use simulations. So another way of saying this is if we have non-Markovian processes. All right. Depending on where you look, you can come up with different lists for what it means to have an individual-based simulations, but let's just talk about some basic elements. And I actually got this list from one of the earliest papers about individual-based simulations used in ecology. So it's kind of fun that it was their motivation for why they needed to use an individual-based model in ecology. And one of them is that you have to have agent-agent behavior. And you can see why this would be very necessary in biology. Really hard to spell and talk at the same time. Okay, agent-agent behavior. You could have interactions with the environment. And this individual variation. So when you want to capture things about individual, like transmission rates or individual decisions, you really need an individual-based model. Yes. Yeah, so this would be like predator-prey interaction. So anything where we have like interacting, COVID is another good example of this. If we wanted to simulate COVID, it's harder to do as a stochastic processes because it's all about how individuals interact. Does that, yeah. And then we can think about how we would analyze a stochastic or an individual base model. And there are really two principles I want you to think about when it comes to analyzing an individual base model. When you build an individual base model, test it. So go to extreme values of your parameters. So for example, turn off selection or have the prey be really good at avoiding the predators. Do something where you go to an extreme case to make sure things behave the way you think that they should. Did you have a question or just checking? Okay, yeah, no problem. So test. It is super easy to lie to yourself. So I was actually having a conversation with my dad the other day, he's a physicist, and we were talking about what would it be like if you didn't get to hear no every day how often you're wrong. Like I know like 10 times a day that I'm wrong, like quantitatively wrong, you know? And so if there's something weird going on in your simulations, it's probably not an emergent phenomenon. It's probably that you coded it wrong. So test. The second thing is that we really need to use statistics. So when we have an individual based model, it is now much more like an experimental study than it is like a mathematical study. So we have now transitioned into the realm of experiment, and so we really need to use statistics to understand our dynamics. So plot things, do formal statistical tests, and similarly, think about it as an experiment, have hypotheses, and test those hypotheses. So a simulation is an experiment in a computer. So it shouldn't be just like taking your word for it. Make sure that you have, do things like you would do in the lab. Vary the level of some input and see how that changes the output. Don't just try two values, try multiple values, right? So use all of the things that we talked about when we talk about experimental design to design individual base models. I just want you to think about them as experiments, not as a computer, as a mathematical object. All right. Any questions about that? Or thoughts? I mean, this is subjective, so you're allowed to have thoughts about this too. Okay, so feel free to jump in at any time, but in the little bit of time we have left, I just wanted to share with you one example of an individual-based simulation that comes from this, one of the first examples of when individual-based simulations were used in ecology. So I've just taken the figures from the paper, and so this is a paper about managing smallmouth bass fishery. And so they propose this diagram, this flow diagram of how their smallmouth bass fishing system works. So there's a ton of different things in here, and this is a common individual-based simulation for biologists. So just to read through some of these, so the smallmouth bass population depends on prey availability, the ability to reproduce, which is positively related to the number of available nesting sites. There's habitat in here, survival, dispersal, and all of these flow up and tell us things about the age distribution of our smallmouth bass, the health of the smallmouth bass, and where they are in space. So they wanted to understand these outcomes, and so they have this complex system. So this is one example of a flow diagram that could be something like what you'd want to create for your literature review, for example. If there was like a diagram like this that would help support the flow or the concepts inside of that chapter, something kind of like this could work. Okay. Let me get these in the right order. Okay. So then they wanted to make the argument that they couldn't model this simply with a mathematical model, that they needed simulations to do this instead. So they talk about how temperature impacts the age distribution and the individual behavior of the fish. So this is that environment-agent interaction, and then it flows into that individual variability. So this is capturing two of those aspects that we laid out as being really important. And then on top of that, we have agent-agent interactions in here because of mating and predation. So they made the argument that they had all the three necessary pieces to motivate the need for an individual-based simulation rather than a stochastic process. And then to complement this, they have data on the temperature profile in a classic year. So this is January through December, and the mean temperature in the water where they're interested in their smallmouth bass population. So they're going to complement their simulations by actually putting real data in for the temperature profile throughout the year. Okay, so then the first thing that they did is they ran some baseline parameters, and they asked what was the distribution in body lengths throughout the year in their smallmouth bass population, and did it match their data? So they dummy checked their model was the first thing. So they wanted to just make sure if they gave it the true temperature profile, that they could put in parameters that would create the realistic length distribution, because they care about the length of the fish, the length of the distribution throughout the year. And so you can see that the length gets longer and longer and longer throughout the year. You start over here in June, and by May of the next year, you have a much heavier distribution of fish. Okay. But then they wanted to say, what would happen if I manipulated different fishing parameters? So I allowed more fishing or I allowed less fishing. What would that do to the age and size distribution of my fish? And that is what they had in their figure 5. So I won't make you read this paper, but it illustrates this idea that they use this as an experiment. So they built this code, they knew that the code worked, they tested it against their data, and then they ran 3 different levels of fishing and asked how did those different levels of fishing impact that length distribution in their fish after 2 years. So this is just one example, but I think it's a really fun paper to read. It's referenced in the notes because it makes a concerted effort to justify why simulations were necessary. So it's really quite a nice orientation to why we need simulations in ecology. That's all I had, but if you guys have thoughts or comments about simulations, we can talk about those now. Okay, well, without any further comments, when we come back on Monday, we're going to talk about a different type of simulation that is a little bit simpler than an agent-based simulation. So one downside of agent-based simulations is that they're complicated. They have these agent-agent interactions. They have agent-environmental interactions. They have individual variability. And so because they're so complicated, they can be often hard to interpret. And so is there sometimes something simpler that we can do that's kind of in between a stochastic simulation and an individual-based model? And so when we come back on Monday, we'll talk about one type of simulation called a cellular automaton simulation, which lets us study how things evolve in space. So one element that's really hard to capture in the stochastic process is spatial dynamics, because we would have to specify a different state for every location in space. And that would get to be a huge stochastic process, right? But we still might want to know what's going on in highly spatially structured environments. And so the cellular automaton is one example of a kind of a simpler agent-based model that happens in space. Anyway, so that's a preview on Monday. So I'll see you on Monday to talk about that.